A trip to the garden store, simple, quiet, and completely ordinary. But what happens next? It isn't just a misunderstanding, it's a collision between prejudice and power when two officers try to turn an innocent black woman into a suspect. What they didn't know was that she wasn't alone, and she wasn't someone to underestimate. Because this woman, Dr. Evelyn Carter, isn't just a retired surgeon. She's the spark that ignites a movement. What follows is a storm of truth resistance and hard-earned justice that will shake an entire community to its core. So settle in, because you're about to hear a story that begins with handcuffs but ends with transformation. Let us know what time you're listening and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below, and if this story grabs you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful, real-life narratives just like this one. On a Tuesday morning in late spring, when the sun had just begun to stretch its warm fingers across the sleepy streets of Ashwood Creek, Dr. Evelyn Carter stepped out of her silver Buick with a quiet sigh, pulling her sweater tighter around her shoulders, though the breeze had softened since dawn. The parking lot outside Dale's Garden Supply was mostly empty, save for a few pickup trucks with rusted bumpers and fading bumper stickers, and the low hum of cicadas was the only sound filling the air besides the distant bark of a dog and the steady crunch of gravel under her feet. Evelyn wasn't in a hurry. She never rushed these days. And though her joints ached more than they used to, there was something comforting about the predictability of her routine, about knowing exactly which potting soil she liked, and how many bags of mulch she could still lift without straining her back. She walked slowly toward the entrance, nodding politely to an older white couple unloading petunias into their trunk. They didn't nod back, but that didn't surprise her. Ashwood Creek was polite, in a practiced kind of way, the kind that smiled, tight-lipped, but never quite made room for people like her. Still, Evelyn had lived long enough to recognize the difference between hostility and discomfort, and she'd learned to move through both with grace. Inside the store, the familiar scent of fertilizer and cedar chips greeted her like an old acquaintance. She pushed a slightly wobbly cart down the center aisle, her steps unhurried as she scanned the shelves for the rose fertilizer her neighbor had recommended. Her fingers brushed against seed packets, zinnias, sweet peas, climbing jasmine, and she paused, letting her mind drift to the corner of her yard where the azaleas were beginning to brown. "I told Marcus we'd need more shade cloth," she muttered under her breath, half to herself, half out of habit. At 62, Evelyn moved with the deliberate care of someone who had spent decades in hospital corridors and operating rooms where precision was survival and panic was a luxury no one could afford. Her hands, though no longer wielding scalpels, still bore the quiet authority of a life spent mending bodies and holding steady through chaos. She didn't need anyone to know who she used to be, but it clung to her posture, to the way she paused before choosing a bag of potting mix, assessing, deciding, moving. It wasn't until she reached the checkout counter that the shift in the air became noticeable, subtle at first, like a change in barometric pressure before a storm. The young cashier, a wiry man no older than her youngest patient's son, watched her too closely, his eyes darting from her gardening gloves to the zip tote hanging from her elbow. Evelyn noticed, but she said nothing. Instead, she smiled gently and placed her items on the counter one by one, careful not to rush. "Beautiful weather today," she offered lightly. The cashier didn't respond. Instead, he stepped back slightly, then reached for the phone mounted behind the register. "Excuse me," she said, frowning slightly. "Is there something wrong?" He didn't answer, just murmured something low into the receiver, while his eyes never left her bag. It wasn't loud enough for her to catch, but she didn't need to hear it. She'd lived this moment before, once in a pharmacy in Alabama, once in a shoe store in Atlanta, and though it never got easier, it was always familiar. A few seconds later, he hung up the phone and cleared his throat. "Could you wait right there, ma'am? Manager's gonna want to speak with you." There was no panic in her face, no alarm in her voice. "I'd just like to pay for these," she replied evenly, gesturing to the modest selection of garden supplies on the counter. "It'll just take a minute," he said, and again his tone told her everything she needed to know. The minutes passed slowly. A pair of customers entered the store, glanced her way, then quickly averted their eyes. No one said anything, but the silence was louder than words. Evelyn stood still, her back straight, her breathing even. She thought of Marcus back home, probably reading the newspaper with his slippers on and a fresh pot of coffee beside him. She thought about how many times she had warned him that moving to Ashwood Creek might feel like stepping backward, that the slower pace came with older ghosts. The manager arrived a few minutes later, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a clipboard tucked under one arm. He didn't introduce himself, didn't offer her a good morning. He simply pointed toward the door and said, "We've had a report. I'm going to need to ask you to step outside while we figure this out." Evelyn blinked once slowly. A report of what exactly, she asked, her tone still calm, though her hands had curled slightly at her sides. "The cashier believes you may have concealed something from the health aisle," he said, motioning vaguely toward the shelves near the registers. "Over-the-counter meds, allergy pills, maybe." She almost laughed, but the absurdity caught in her throat like a splinter. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "That's not only untrue, it's ridiculous." The man shrugged. "We've already called the sheriff's department. They'll be here shortly." Evelyn stared at him for a long, steady moment, then reached slowly for her phone. "I'd like to call my husband," she said quietly. "Put that down, ma'am," the manager snapped suddenly louder. "We don't want to escalate things." And just like that, it wasn't about allergy pills anymore, it was about control. About roles. About who was allowed to act calm and who was expected to be compliant. Evelyn lowered her phone, lips pressed together. She was used to being mistaken for the nurse instead of the doctor, for someone who needed to explain why she belonged in spaces that never expected her. But this was different. This was deliberate. This was accusation without evidence, fear without cause, and humiliation without shame. She stood there silent and still listening, as the faint whine of sirens grew louder in the distance. Her pulse didn't quicken, her face didn't flinch. She simply looked up at the ceiling lights above the checkout lane and whispered under her breath, almost like a prayer, "Marcus, I hope you're paying attention." And in that stillness, in that breathless, fluorescent-lit silence, something deep within her settled not into fear, but into readiness. She didn't hear them before she saw them, two sheriff's cruisers pulling up to the curb with the kind of heavy, deliberate slowness that made every glance feel like a sentence already handed down. Evelyn remained standing beside the shopping cart, her back still straight, hands clasped gently in front of her like she had just stepped out of Sunday service, not a garden store under suspicion. The parking lot had quieted suddenly, as if the air itself was holding its breath, and the few customers still coming and going did so with exaggerated casualness, eyes flickering in her direction and then quickly away. She could feel the weight of being watched, without being seen, judged, without being known, and she reminded herself again that she'd done absolutely nothing wrong. The first deputy to step out was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with mirrored sunglasses and a jaw that looked clenched even when he wasn't speaking. The other was thinner, younger, the kind who seemed eager to follow rather than lead. "Ma'am," the older one called, walking with the kind of swagger that came from knowing most people stepped aside when you approached. "We got a call from the manager here. Need to ask you a few questions." Evelyn nodded, once her voice calm. "Of course. I'd appreciate knowing what this is about." He didn't respond, just looked past her to the store entrance where the cashier and manager were standing stiffly, arms crossed, faces full of exaggerated concern. She noticed the younger deputy drifting toward her left side, as if preparing for a maneuver, and she gently repositioned herself, keeping both of them in her peripheral view without seeming defensive. Years of hospital training had made her good at reading energy, at sensing when people were about to escalate something just because they didn't know how to de-escalate it. The older deputy stepped closer. "Name and ID, please." Evelyn reached slowly into her handbag, her motions careful and visible. "Dr. Evelyn Carter," she said, placing her driver's license in his waiting hand. "Retired physician. I live 2 blocks from here on Hemlock Road." The deputy gave the card a cursory glance before passing it to his partner. "You live in Hemlock?" he asked, his tone drifting toward disbelief. "That's a nice area," she nodded. "My husband and I moved there last spring." The younger deputy raised an eyebrow and said, "Mind telling us where you were before?" That Evelyn met his eyes. "Atlanta. We moved here to slow down a little." The older one let out a half laugh, half snort. "Yeah, well, we've had some complaints lately. Shoplifting, mostly. You wouldn't happen to have anything in your purse we should know about?" It wasn't a question, not really. Evelyn's fingers curled slightly at her side. "Number. Just my wallet, keys, and phone." She spoke slowly, deliberately. "I haven't taken anything. You're welcome to speak to me, but I won't be treated like a criminal without cause." The deputy didn't appreciate the firmness in her tone. He stepped in closer voice, lower now. "We've been authorized to search you if necessary." Evelyn held her ground. "Then I'd like to speak with my husband first." That's when his expression changed. "Put your hands behind your back, ma'am, now." She stared at him, stunned for a fraction of a second. "Are you arresting me?" she asked, her voice firm but even. "Not complying is grounds for detention," he replied. And just like that, her hands were yanked back, wrists twisted as cold metal clamped around them. The sharp click of the cuffs echoed louder than it should have in the quiet morning air. Pain shot up her arm as the deputy cinched the cuffs tighter than necessary, and she winced not from fear, but from the insult, from the sheer absurdity of being reduced to this. A retired doctor, a community volunteer, a woman who'd spent her life helping others, now hauled away like someone caught slipping batteries into her purse. "You're hurting me," she said quietly. "I need my hands. I'm a surgeon." The younger deputy laughed just once. "Well, Doc, maybe next time don't steal allergy meds, huh?" Evelyn looked straight ahead as they marched her past her cart, the bags of mulch still resting neatly inside. The parking lot, once filled with quiet errands and morning chatter, had transformed into a silent amphitheater of shame. Phones were out now recording, of course, but not a single voice spoke up. Not one person said, "She didn't do anything." Not one person said, "This doesn't look right." That was what struck her more than the handcuffs, more than the bruising on her wrist. It was the silence of neighbors who would wave at her on a good day, but had nothing to say on this one. As they guided her toward the cruiser, she looked up at the sky. It was blue and wide without a cloud in sight, and she thought briefly about the tomatoes she had planned to plant that afternoon. Her pulse was steady now, the sting of humiliation settling into a strange kind of clarity. They thought this would end here. They thought she would cry or beg or fold in on herself like paper. But she knew better. She wasn't just some woman caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was Evelyn Carter, and the call she'd made on her watch was already on its way to someone who would not under any circumstances let this stand. As the cruiser door opened and she was guided inside, her eyes met the reflection in the rearview mirror. She didn't see fear in that face. She didn't see defeat. What she saw was resolve, weathered, weary, and bruised, but unbroken. And that was something they hadn't counted on. At precisely 10:48 a.m., the soft chime on Clarence Carter's phone pulsed, once a signal he and Evelyn had set months ago, but never used a silent code between husband and wife that said something was wrong, terribly wrong, and there wasn't time to explain. He had been sitting at the breakfast table, glasses perched low on his nose, reading an editorial about judicial reform in the state capitol, with the remnants of his second cup of coffee cooling in the porcelain mug beside him. The house was quiet, just the steady tick of the wall clock and the soft rustle of morning light through the kitchen blinds, a peaceful moment interrupted not by sound but by the unmistakable dread that gripped his chest the second he saw her name on the alert. He stood immediately, phone already in his hand, scanning the screen, noting her exact location pinned just outside Dale's garden supply, frozen for over 5 minutes now. Clarence didn't need to ask questions, not yet. He moved with a kind of still urgency, calm on the surface, but pulsing with purpose just beneath. He tapped twice to pull up the private list labeled Emergency Contacts. Legal. A file he'd built not out of paranoia but out of long experience and quiet understanding that life didn't always respect status, service, or good intentions. He made his first call to Elijah Woodard, an old friend from his federal circuit days, now working civil rights cases out of Atlanta, then sent a short voice memo to Captain Reese, a retired FBI liaison who owed him more than a few favors. Only after those wheels were in motion did he call Evelyn, and when she didn't answer, something in him hardened. He walked to the hallway, pulled on his brown leather jacket, the one with the inside pocket stitched specifically for documents, and checked to ensure the folder with both of their IDs, property records, and professional credentials was still inside. Then he slid his wedding ring around on his finger, a nervous habit he hadn't done in years, and whispered to himself, "All right, sweetheart, I'm coming." The Buick turned over with a low growl as he backed out of their driveway, glancing once at the hydrangeas Evelyn had planted along the front walk. He remembered her excitement when they'd first moved to Ashwood Creek. How she had said it reminded her of the quiet Georgia towns from her childhood, but safer, gentler, more dignified somehow, until it wasn't. As he drove the 10-minute route toward the store, Clarence replayed every similar moment they had ever endured, each small indignity dressed up as policy, each polite dismissal wrapped in the language of concern, and he realized with a quiet ache that this moment had always been waiting for them. He had worked for decades as a federal judge, sat through hearings that shaped lives and rewrote futures, but none of that mattered when the wrong person held the wrong assumption in their hand like a weapon. The town might have smiled when they moved in, but he knew those smiles didn't reach the corners of their eyes. Still, they had stayed, choosing to believe that dignity earned would one day be dignity recognized. Traffic slowed as he turned onto Maple Ridge Avenue, his knuckles pale against the steering wheel, and he could see the store in the distance just beyond a line of parked patrol cars and curious onlookers. He pulled into the lot, slowly scanning faces, noting the posture of the officers near the entrance, and finally spotting her, his Evelyn, standing in handcuffs beside their shopping cart, eyes forward, body still like a woman containing a storm. Behind her spine, Clarence exhaled once sharply, then stepped out of the car and adjusted the collar of his jacket. The air was too still for such a bright day, and the only thing louder than the silence was the ringing in his ears. He crossed the parking lot not with rage but with intent, each step firm, each breath controlled, the same way he had walked into courtrooms with men twice his size and half his patience. "Officers," he said clearly, his voice cutting through the air like a verdict. Both men turned, one visibly startled, the other tightening his jaw. "I'm Clarence Carter, retired federal judge. That's my wife, Dr. Evelyn Carter, and I'd like to know why she's in restraints." There was a pause, not long, but long enough to register discomfort, before the older deputy stepped forward and said, "Sir, this is an active investigation. I'll have to ask you to remain at a distance." Clarence didn't move. "No, son, what you'll have to do is explain to me why a woman who has committed no crime is being humiliated in public, and why the burden of proof always seems to fall on the one least likely to have done anything wrong." His tone was level, but his eyes didn't blink. The younger deputy opened his mouth to speak, but seemed to think better of it. Evelyn looked at her husband then, and for the first time since the cuffs had clicked around her wrists, she allowed herself to exhale. She didn't need to say a word. That small shift in her shoulders, that slight unclenching of her jaw, it said everything. Clarence had arrived, and with him came a different kind of justice, one forged not in vengeance but in memory, in precedent, in every closed-door conversation and whispered warning he'd endured over the years. He stepped closer, slowly, deliberately, and said again, softer this time, "You need to take those cuffs off her, right now." The officers hesitated. The store manager hovered in the background, eyes darting between the scene and the phones beginning to appear in bystanders' hands. Clarence turned his head slightly, noticing a teenager filming near the edge of the sidewalk, and gave a single nod, not for himself, but for the record, for history. He had learned long ago that truth didn't always win the moment, but it needed to be seen if it was going to have a chance. One of the officers finally reached for his belt, fumbling for the keys, his mouth tight with frustration as he unlocked the cuffs without a word. Evelyn's hands fell to her sides, red marks blooming around her wrists like silent bruises. Clarence stepped beside her and gently took her hand, inspecting the damage. "Are you all right?" he asked, barely above a whisper. She nodded once, but her eyes were wet. He didn't press. Instead, he turned back to the deputies and said quietly, "I'd like both your badge numbers and the name of your supervisor. You've just made a very serious mistake." The older officer shifted uncomfortably, muttered something about protocol, but Clarence had already pulled a small notepad from his inner pocket and began writing. Around them, the lot remained unnaturally quiet, the crowd still watching, the phones still rolling. Evelyn stood a little taller, brushing her palms together, her voice steady now. "I came here to buy fertilizer," she said to no one in particular, "and ended up needing a witness." She glanced at her husband, who simply nodded. "You have one," he said. "You have several." And as they stood there in the middle of that parking lot beneath the indifferent sun, and surrounded by silence posing as peace, Clarence realized something deeper than anger had settled inside him, something he couldn't yet name, but which he knew he would carry for a long, long time. The stillness of the parking lot began to unravel the moment the first camera phone was raised, quiet, at first uncertain, just a single hand trembling slightly as its owner pressed record. But then another followed and another until what had been silent observation turned into digital witness, capturing every shift in posture, every flicker of doubt on the officers' faces. Clarence Carter stood beside his wife, his presence calm but undeniable, a man who knew exactly how power dressed itself in public clean boots, pressed shirts, mirrored sunglasses, and how easily it unraveled under the right kind of light. His voice hadn't risen not once, but it didn't need to. Authority, when earned, didn't shout. It simply stood its ground until the other side blinked. The officers were blinking now. They weren't used to being watched like this, not with this kind of scrutiny, not with people quietly documenting every gesture, every breath. One officer adjusted his belt with a nervous twitch, the other glanced toward the manager, who now looked like he wanted to disappear into the mulch bags stacked by the sliding glass door. Evelyn hadn't said a word since the cuffs were removed, her eyes steady, her body still humming with the indignity she was working so hard not to let show. Clarence could feel her pulse through the fingers she kept pressed against his palm, and in that small pressure he could read her entire state, furious, humiliated, and determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing either. A soft murmur rippled through the growing crowd as a second car pulled in, not a cruiser this time, but a black SUV with tinted windows and an official government plate. The door opened with quiet finality, and from the driver's side emerged a tall woman in uniform, Lieutenant Angela Ray, U.S. Air Force Reserve, longtime friend and legal consultant. She didn't say a word as she approached, just gave Clarence a subtle nod and positioned herself beside him like they were standing for an official photograph. Behind her came two more vehicles, both unmarked but unmistakably federal, called in by Clarence's earlier voice memo, the ripple effect of a single alert spreading outward like rings in water. Now the mood shifted palpably. What had begun as routine overreach, an officer's assumption hardened into action, was transforming second by second into a spectacle no one could control. The younger deputy looked visibly pale now, his gaze flicking between Clarence and the newly arrived officials. The elder one held firmer, but his posture had changed. He stood straighter, spoke less. This was no longer a local matter, and he knew it. A woman in the crowd whispered, "Is that the judge's wife?" And the man beside her replied, "I think she used to be a doctor, maybe still is." Someone else murmured, "She's the one that runs the free clinic on Saturdays." That was how reputations worked in small towns. They hid until the moment they were needed, and then, like buried seeds, they rose. Clarence stepped forward again, this time not to demand but to remind. "Officers," he said, his tone, "even you are now in the presence of federal observers and legal counsel. I would advise you to proceed with caution." The lieutenant beside him spoke for the first time. "We are also recording. Any further action taken without cause will be escalated through the appropriate judicial channels." It wasn't a threat, it was a promise delivered with the crispness of someone who had made similar statements in courtrooms, in military hearings, in places where the law wasn't just theory but consequence. The deputies nodded, but didn't respond. Their hands now hovered near their belts, not because they intended to draw anything, but because they didn't know what else to do with them. Evelyn finally moved, then slowly, her voice low but deliberate. "May I have my receipt, please?" she asked the manager, who startled slightly, then hurried into the store without a word. When he returned, red-faced and breathless, he handed it to her without looking up. She folded it once, then tucked it into the inside pocket of her canvas tote like a piece of evidence. Clarence turned to her, voice softer now. "You ready to go?" She nodded, but before they could move, a reporter appeared, microphone in hand, camera crew at her shoulder, asking for a statement. Clarence held up a hand and said, "Not now," and the woman, to her credit, stepped back. This wasn't the moment for press. It was the moment for breath, for centering, for regaining what had been forcibly taken just minutes before. As they walked toward their car, Clarence placed his hand gently on the small of Evelyn's back, guiding her without rushing, and for the first time that morning she let herself lean slightly into him, just enough to draw strength without surrendering pride. The murmurs of the crowd followed them, not jeering now, not judging, but wondering about the woman who had stood silently, while others decided her guilt about the man who had appeared like a shadow cast by something larger than himself, about what it meant to see power shift, not through violence but through poise, presence, and documentation. When they reached the car, Clarence opened the door for her, waited until she was seated, then closed it gently. He He rounded the hood and took one last look at the store, the officers, the crowd, the manager, now trying to act like he belonged somewhere else entirely. He met the older deputy's eyes one final time, not with hatred, not even with anger, but with a stillness that said, "You've shown us who you are, the rest is just paperwork." Then he got in, started the engine, and the two of them pulled away in silence, their car gliding out of the lot as quietly as it had arrived. Inside the vehicle, Evelyn exhaled long and low as if she'd been holding it since the moment the cuffs first bit into her wrists. "They really thought I was just going to stand there and let them rewrite who I was," she said softly. Clarence didn't answer right away. He simply reached over and took her hand again, thumb brushing gently across the still red marks that circled her skin like phantom chains. And as the town receded behind them and the blue sky stretched wide ahead, she turned her gaze out the window and whispered, "Not today." The tension in the parking lot had begun to crystallize the way air does just before a summer storm, thick, pressing, and oddly quiet. Clarence could feel it in the way people shifted on their feet without taking a step in the way. Conversations hushed mid-sentence, and in the uneasy glances passing between the officers, who just moments earlier had seemed so confident in the righteousness of their actions. Evelyn stood next to him, calm on the surface, but he could see the way her fingers twitched ever so slightly at her sides, as if trying to shake off the memory of cold steel pressing into her wrists. The sun had risen higher now, casting long shadows across the asphalt, turning the scene into a kind of silent theater with too many actors and no clear script. Clarence glanced around, noting the growing crowd, the small collection of townsfolk who had come to pick up flower pots or birdseed, and now found themselves audience to a slow unraveling of authority. A woman in a floral sundress clutched her shopping bag a little tighter, her eyes wide with something between confusion and concern. A teenage boy leaned against his bicycle, filming everything on his phone with the solemn focus of someone who understood, even at his age, that moments like this could vanish unless captured. Across the lot, an older man in a dusty denim jacket stood stiffly beside his truck, his gaze fixed not on the police or the couple, but on the ripple forming beneath all of it, truth rising to the surface, whether people wanted it or not. Then it happened so quietly that at first no one noticed. A soft, strained gasp, followed by a hollow-sounding cough, like the kind that comes from a chest too tight to breathe. Clarence turned instinctively toward the sound, just in time to see a man stagger forward, clutching his chest with one hand and grabbing at the open air with the other, his hat tumbling from his head onto the hot pavement. He recognized him instantly, Pastor Thomas Bell, 83 years old, longtime pillar of the First Baptist Church of Ashwood Creek, a man whose voice had baptized children, buried the old, and comforted the grieving in this town for more than 5 decades. Thomas Clarence called, already moving, but it was Evelyn who reacted first. She dropped her taut knees, bending with a grace that belied her age, and crossed the few feet between them in seconds. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, voice steady, hands already at work, loosening his collar, checking his pulse. "I'm Dr. Carter. I need you to stay still." Pastor Bell's lips parted, but no words came, just a thin wheeze and a look of recognition that flickered across his eyes like a match quickly snuffed out. Evelyn pressed her fingers to his neck, her other hand moving to brace his head. "He's going into cardiac distress," she said without looking up. "Someone call 911 now." The crowd stirred, startled into motion. The teenager dropped his phone into his pocket and took off running toward the main road. A woman fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. One of the deputies started to move forward, hand resting instinctively on his belt, but Clarence stepped into his path, his voice low and cutting. "Don't interfere. She's trying to save his life." Evelyn was already performing compressions, her movements fluid and firm, counting under her breath with the rhythm she'd used countless times in emergency rooms across Georgia. Sweat beaded at her brow, but her face remained composed, eyes fixed on the rise and fall, or lack thereof, of the pastor's chest. "Lieutenant Ray," she called out, "get me something to cushion his head, and I need someone to find aspirin if there's any nearby." The lieutenant didn't hesitate, tearing the sleeve from her own jacket and folding it beneath the man's head with practiced speed. A bystander rushed forward with a travel bottle of baby aspirin and held it out like a sacred offering. Clarence knelt beside her, not touching, just anchoring the space around them, watching as the woman who had been treated like a criminal moments earlier now moved with the full authority of her calling. Pastor Bell's eyes fluttered open briefly, and Evelyn leaned in, speaking softly. "Don't try to talk, sir. Help is on the way. You're safe." Just breathe with me." His hand reached up, weak and trembling, brushing her sleeve. "Tried to speak up," he whispered hoarsely. "But I was afraid." She didn't pause in her work. "I know," she murmured. "Rest now. We've got you." The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, cutting through the air with the clarity of consequence. The paramedics arrived in a rush, equipment clicking, voices exchanging quick commands as they took over. "What we got?" the lead medic asked, already kneeling beside the patient. "Cardiac event approximately 5 minutes down," Evelyn answered briskly. "CPR administered on site. No meds yet. He's alert but unstable." One of the medics looked up, recognition dawning. "Doctor, Carter didn't know you were on scene." She nodded once. "I was here for something else." Her voice didn't waver, but Clarence saw the flicker of something behind her eyes, a deep, worn-out fatigue that came not from physical exertion, but from carrying the weight of composure for far too long. As they loaded Pastor Bell onto the gurney, he reached out again, his fingers barely brushing Evelyn's wrist. "Thank you," he whispered. "I should have said something sooner." She smiled gently. "Rest now, Reverend. We'll talk when you're stronger." And then he was gone, swallowed into the ambulance, its doors shutting, with a solid thud that echoed across the pavement like a final punctuation mark. The crowd, which had grown to nearly 50 people, stood in stunned silence, the moment suspended between disbelief and reckoning. The woman they had watched be handcuffed was now the woman who had brought a man back from the edge. The officers who had once stood like sentinels of certainty now lingered at the periphery, unsure of their place, their authority visibly shrinking beneath the weight of public scrutiny. Even the store manager, who had kept to the background now, seemed smaller, diminished by the unfolding of events he neither anticipated nor understood. Clarence reached for Evelyn's hand again, and this time she let him hold it longer. He looked at her, his voice just above a whisper. "You all right?" She nodded slowly, the line of her jaw still tight. "I will be." Then she turned to face the crowd, not as a victim, not as someone seeking pity, but as a witness to her own truth. She didn't say a word, but in the way she stood, shoulders back, head high, hands still marked from where the cuffs had bitten, there was more than any speech could carry. And as the ambulance pulled away into the distance, the low hum of its engine blending with the returning sounds of morning life, Evelyn Carter stood in the very same spot she had been humiliated now, surrounded not by accusation but by silent acknowledgement. Not celebration, not apology, but something closer to recognition. The kind that doesn't erase pain but says, at the very least, I saw it too. By late afternoon, the video had already begun to circulate, first on local message boards, then through Facebook shares, and by early evening it had reached the screens of people who didn't know Evelyn Carter by name, but who now recognized the sharp injustice etched into every frame of footage. The clip opened with her standing quietly in handcuffs, flanked by 2 officers, her face unreadable but unmistakably dignified, and closed with her kneeling beside a fallen man, her hands compressing his chest with practiced urgency, while the same officers stood paralyzed a few steps away. No one needed a narrator to explain the shift in tone. The silence of that crowd, once complicit, now hung heavier than the sirens that had blared just moments before. Clarence sat at the edge of their living room couch that evening, still in the same leather jacket he had worn to the garden store, his phone buzzing every few minutes with texts, emails, and calls, some from reporters, some from former colleagues, and some from strangers, offering messages of support or warning. Evelyn had showered and changed into one of her soft cotton house dresses, the kind she wore when she wanted to feel nothing clinging to her skin. She moved slowly now, not from pain, but from the sheer emotional weight of what had passed, the way it settles over the body when adrenaline drains and reality takes its place. Neither of them spoke much, but the quiet wasn't uncomfortable, just necessary. She sat by the window for a long time, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, gone cold, watching the shadows of oak trees sway across the sidewalk like old spirits passing through. Somewhere down the block, a neighbor's dog barked twice and then stopped. From outside, the world seemed to have returned to normal, but they both knew better. Normal had shifted. The ground beneath them, once stable in its familiarity, now felt like something borrowed, fragile, subject to sudden rupture. The first threat came as a voicemail left on their landline, an anonymous voice disguised through static, warning them not to push this thing too far. Clarence didn't play it for her, not right away. Instead, he saved it, forwarded a copy to Elijah, and added it to the growing digital file he had begun, compiling time-stamped folders with names like evidence, contacts, and threats. He wasn't afraid, not in the traditional sense, but he knew the terrain. Systems pushed back, when challenged, especially by those they once thought compliant. That night, before going to bed, he checked every lock on the house twice and closed the blinds with the careful hand of someone who no longer believed privacy was a given. The following morning brought more subtle reminders. Their mailbox was ajar, though they had closed it the night before. A smear of something oily stretched across their front door handle, too faint to leave a stain but visible enough to notice if you were looking. Clarence made a note of it, snapped a photo, and didn't mention it to Evelyn until hours later, when she was already on her second patient call of the day and too focused to be distracted by small cruelties. "They'll get louder before they get smarter," she said simply when he told her. "That's how fear behaves." But it wasn't just anonymous voices or passive-aggressive vandalism. They could feel the shift in people's eyes, even if those people didn't say a word. At the grocery store 2 days later, Evelyn noticed how the same cashier who once greeted her with a polite smile now avoided her altogether, scanning her items quickly without a glance. The pharmacist, usually chatty, kept her tone short-clipped professional. Clarence noticed it at the post office too, where an elderly man he'd spoken with dozens of times now chose the line on the other side of the room. Then there was the envelope. No name, no return address, just typed words, clipped from newsprint and glued to printer paper, forming a sentence that read, "Doctors should stick to medicine, not politics." Elijah reviewed it, confirmed there were no direct threats, but it was enough to merit a report. Clarence filed it with the sheriff's department, knowing full well how little would come of it. Still, not all reactions came wrapped in threat. A retired schoolteacher left a handwritten letter on their doorstep, folded neatly in an envelope with no postage. It read, "I watched what happened. I wish I'd said something. You reminded me what integrity looks like." Evelyn kept that one tucked in her journal next to old notes from patients who had thanked her not just for treatment but for listening when no one else had. At night, sleep came in short waves. Evelyn often lay awake staring at the ceiling, remembering how it felt to be surrounded by people who watched but did nothing, how their silence had bruised more deeply than the handcuffs ever could. "It's not the violence I keep reliving," she told Clarence one night. "It's the stillness, the fact that they all just stood there like it was normal." He didn't have an answer, just pulled her closer, wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and let the quiet fill the space where comfort couldn't yet reach. By the end of the week, national news outlets had begun to pick up the story, framing it with headlines that sanitized the deeper truth. "Respected doctor wrongly detained. Heroism at the heart of small-town incident." But Evelyn knew the danger of stories that wrapped injustice in too much redemption. They made it easier for people to believe it was a one-time failure, rather than a symptom of something woven deep into the fabric. Clarence had been invited to speak on a regional radio program. He declined. "This isn't about us," he said. "Not yet. Let's see who else steps forward." And they did quietly at first. A young black teacher wrote an op-ed in the local paper about being followed home by an officer late one evening. A Korean-American business owner recounted being stopped 3 times in a month while driving to his shop. A white woman, 62 and widowed, admitted in a letter to the editor that she'd watched the scene at the garden store and felt ashamed for saying nothing. "I think," Evelyn said one morning as they drank coffee at the kitchen table, "this might be the real shift. Not the story they're telling, but the stories people are suddenly remembering." Clarence nodded, his eyes tired but clear. Truth doesn't stay buried forever. It just needs enough voices to unearth it. Later that day, while pruning the hydrangeas in front of their house, Evelyn noticed a little girl from down the street, watching her from the sidewalk, holding the hand of her mother. She smiled, soft but steady, and raised a hand in quiet greeting. The mother hesitated for a moment, then returned the wave. The girl beamed. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was something. And as Evelyn turned back to her garden fingertips, dusted with earth and sun warming the back of her neck, she felt the strange, steady hum of resilience, like roots, settling deeper after a storm, holding firm not in defiance, but in quiet, unwavering knowing. Clarence Carter had always believed in the value of quiet preparation, the kind of work that rarely made headlines but built a foundation no storm could shake. In the days following the incident, while Evelyn fielded press inquiries with calm dignity and avoided interviews that tried to reduce her experience to a headline, Clarence turned his focus inward, methodically digging beneath the surface of their quiet town. He wasn't just a retired federal judge. He was a man who had spent decades learning how systems protected themselves, how prejudice disguised itself in policy, and how silence, when left unchallenged, could become a weapon more powerful than force. He began in the most obvious place, public records. Late into the evening, long after Evelyn had gone to bed with a book balanced on her chest, and the hallway light still flickering, he sat at his desk, surrounded by old case files, printed property deeds, city council minutes, and homeowner association newsletters. The HOA's name kept surfacing: Oak Hollow Preservation Committee, a name so benign it almost escaped scrutiny. But Clarence noticed patterns, and what stood out most wasn't what was written, but what wasn't. Applications denied without explanation, families who withdrew offers after community feedback, enforcement letters for mailbox colors and grass height, but only addressed to certain households. He reached out to his contacts in property law, asked quiet questions, requested archived emails using legal back channels, and slowly began stitching together a picture. He wasn't alone in his efforts. Jade Mendoza, a young investigative journalist with a sharp eye and a personal stake in structural equity, had contacted them through a mutual friend. She had been working for over a year on a story about racial bias in suburban housing practices, but lacked a breakthrough until she saw the video of Evelyn. When Clarence met her at a quiet cafe off the highway, she brought a laptop full of heat maps, audio interviews, and neighborhood demographic reports. "There's something happening in Oakwood County," she said softly, her fingers clicking through slides. "Something coordinated. Your wife's story isn't the outlier, it's the blueprint." Together, they followed the digital breadcrumb trail. Police dispatch records showed a disproportionate number of calls originating from the same streets in Oak Hollow. The complainants, repeatedly the same handful of residents, most of them connected either directly or through family to the HOA board. Clarence recognized one name immediately: Gerald Whitmore, a local businessman who had served on both the board and the Chamber of Commerce. A little deeper digging revealed something more unsettling. Whitmore's sister was married to Officer Harlan, a sheriff's deputy, who often responded to those calls. It wasn't conspiracy in the dramatic sense, it was proximity, favor trading, and quiet conversations that never made it into minutes or memos. But it went deeper still. Jade uncovered financial filings that showed the HOA had contributed security grants to the sheriff's department, small, unofficial stipends for community presence enhancements, conveniently tied to increased patrols in their area. It wasn't illegal on the surface, but it raised every red flag Clarence had learned to spot. With her research and his legal framing, they built a report that didn't rely on outrage, it relied on facts, and the facts were damning. Evelyn watched their progress with a mixture of admiration and unease. "You're building a case," she said one night, leaning against the doorframe of his study, arms crossed loosely. "But what if no one listens?" Clarence didn't look up right away. He was scanning an email thread between the HOA president and a city zoning official. When he did speak, his voice was steady. "They don't have to listen, they just have to respond." That was the difference between protest and pressure. One asked to be heard, the other required an answer. Meanwhile, their neighborhood began to show signs of discomfort. A lawn service they'd used for 2 years suddenly canceled without notice. Packages arrived late, sometimes opened. They received 3 HOA citations in a week for minor infractions. The garbage bins hadn't been pulled in quickly enough. The shutters needed repainting. The backyard tree hung slightly over the fence line. Evelyn read each one silently, then filed them in a drawer without comment. "They're trying to make us feel like we don't belong," she said finally. As if belonging was ever something they had the right to give. Clarence kept his voice low when he replied. "They're not prepared for someone who won't flinch." He meant her, but also himself. Because every petty act only deepened their resolve, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. Not responding would only affirm the assumption that dignity could be revoked. Word of their work began to spread quietly through town. A city clerk emailed anonymously to provide additional files. A young officer recently transferred from another county dropped an envelope at their porch with handwritten notes about an unofficial watch list circulated within the department. It wasn't formal, just a few names shared on group texts with phrases like, "Keep an eye on this one," or "Too much attitude." Evelyn's name was there, right below a schoolteacher who had spoken out at a town hall 6 months earlier. When Clarence showed her the note, she didn't react with surprise. "They're not just afraid of disruption," she said slowly. "They're afraid of accountability." that someone might not just survive the injustice, but name it, document it, and make them answer for it. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his, letting the silence settle before continuing. That's what you're doing. That's what scares them. And it was working. The county commission called an emergency meeting to address growing concerns over community police relations. The sheriff's department issued a brief but defensive statement about following standard protocol. Jade's story was scheduled for publication the following week, front-page Sunday edition, with maps, statistics, and interviews from residents who had remained silent for too long. One of those residents was an elderly black man named Charles Lattimore, who had lived in Oak Hollow for nearly 30 years. He called Clarence after reading a short piece in the local newsletter. "I didn't speak up when they fined me for my porch swing," he said, voice slow and gravelly. "Told me it didn't match the aesthetic. I knew what they meant, but I was tired and I let it slide." He paused and Clarence waited. "You and your wife, you didn't let it slide. That matters." Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the pines and the air took on that thick, humid stillness of southern twilight, Clarence stepped onto the porch, a folder of documents in one hand and a cup of tea in the other. He looked out at the street, quiet, manicured, seemingly untouched, and thought of all the names, dates, and connections now mapped in his files. It wasn't everything, it wasn't even enough yet, but it was a start. And standing there with the porch light, casting a golden hue across the worn wood beneath his feet, Clarence Carter understood something Evelyn had said days earlier. Something simple but immovable. We don't need them to welcome us. We just need them to know we're not leaving. The Ashwood Creek Community Hall wasn't built for conflict. It was designed for bake sales, church suppers, and the kind of town meetings where neighbors argued about zoning lines and school bus routes before shaking hands on the way out. But that evening, as the sky turned, the dusky amber of a southern spring night and rows of folding chairs filled one by one, the atmosphere was different, quieter, heavier, as though the room itself understood that what was about to unfold couldn't be softened by pleasantries or paper cups of lemonade. Clarence and Evelyn arrived 10 minutes early, not because they wanted to be the first faces seen, but because they knew the importance of being visible, of occupying space with calm intention before the room decided who they were for them. Evelyn wore a navy blue blouse, simple but elegant, the sleeves rolled neatly to her elbows, her wedding ring glinting in the overhead lights as she shook hands with those brave enough to approach. Clarence stood at her side, jacket folded over his arm, the press of documents tucked under his elbow, not as a threat but as a quiet reminder they had come prepared with facts, not fury. Around them, murmurs rose and fell like ocean waves, polite greetings layered over cautious glances, some of them curious, others tight with skepticism. The town's mayor sat near the front, lips pressed into a line too narrow to read, flanked by council members whose expressions ranged from performative neutrality to veiled concern. The sheriff arrived late, drawing a few raised eyebrows, then took a seat in the second row, with his arms crossed and jaw set like concrete. When Evelyn stepped to the podium, she didn't clear her throat or fumble with notes. She simply looked at the room for a long moment, her hands resting lightly on either side of the wooden lectern, and then began to speak, not loudly, not with theatrics, but with a steady, measured tone that made even the coughs in the back row fall silent. "My name is Dr. Evelyn Carter. I've been a physician for more than 30 years. I've delivered babies, comforted the dying, treated wounds no one saw until they bled through. I moved to Ashwood Creek because I believed it was a place where dignity could take root, where a life of service would be met with equal grace. And yet 2 weeks ago, I stood in this town's grocery store with my hands cuffed behind my back for a crime I didn't commit." She paused, then not for effect, but because the moment deserved it. Her eyes swept the room, not challenging, not pleading, just insisting on being seen. "I've been asked more than once why I didn't raise my voice, why I didn't fight back. And the answer is simple. I've spent a lifetime learning how to survive by staying composed in rooms that weren't built for me. But make no mistake, silence is not acceptance. Restraint is not submission. And survival should never be the price of belonging." Clarence watched her from his seat, his fingers interlaced knuckles white with restraint. He knew how hard it was for her to speak, not as a doctor or a wife or a neighbor, but as a woman whose very presence had been questioned by people too polite to admit their assumptions. The room, for all its air conditioning, had grown warmer, now eyeglasses slipping down noses, fans clicking softly in back corners, tension riding the still air like static before a lightning strike. Evelyn continued, her voice unwavering. "This isn't just about me. It's about what happened before me and what might happen after me if nothing changes. It's about a culture of suspicion that treats some people like neighbors and others like intruders, based solely on how they look, where they came from, or what part of town they live in. It's about a system that punished me for existing outside someone else's comfort zone. A few heads nodded slowly. One woman near the aisle dabbed her eyes with a folded tissue, but others stared straight ahead, unmoving, their bodies rigid in a way that suggested not ignorance but resistance, the kind bred not by logic but by a lifetime of unexamined privilege. Evelyn didn't look away. "You don't have to be the one tightening the cuffs to be part of the problem," she said quietly. "Sometimes all it takes is standing still while someone else suffers." When she stepped back from the podium, there was no applause at first, just a deep, lingering silence, one that didn't ask for validation but demanded reflection. Clarence stood and took her hand, their fingers locking instinctively. The moderator, clearly flustered, shuffled his papers before awkwardly inviting others to speak. What followed wasn't a flood, but a steady trickle. A young teacher, voice trembling, spoke of being stopped twice in 1 month while driving home after night class. An older man, white-haired and red-faced, admitted he hadn't known how to respond when his neighbor called the police on a suspicious woman who turned out to be Evelyn pruning her front hedge. But the turning point came when Charles Lattimore, dressed in a faded brown suit and leaning heavily on a cane, stood with the help of 2 volunteers and slowly made his way to the front. "I'm not here to give a speech," he said, voice thin but clear. "I just want to say, I saw it. I saw what they did to you, and I didn't say anything, and I've been carrying that ever since." He paused, drawing a shaky breath. "You reminded me what silence costs," and then, without waiting for a reply, he returned to his seat, leaving the room filled not with applause, but with the quiet weight of truth finally spoken aloud. The meeting closed with the mayor offering a generic promise to look into department practices, and the sheriff saying he'd stand by his men unless proven otherwise. It wasn't resolution, not yet, but something had cracked. Clarence and Evelyn walked out into the night under a sky thick with stars, neither triumphant nor defeated, just certain of one thing: they had shifted the center of gravity. Not enough to change the world, but enough to make it tilt ever so slightly toward justice. And as they stood beneath the flickering porchlight of the community hall, the air smelled of cut grass and warm pavement, and Evelyn turned to Clarence and said, "It's not enough to survive this time. We have to make sure someone else doesn't have to." He didn't reply, just nodded once, and reached to hold the door open for her as they stepped into the soft hush of the evening. The day of the hearing arrived beneath a gray sky that seemed to mirror the weight pressing across Evelyn's chest, not from nerves exactly, but from the immense responsibility that came with carrying not just her own truth, but the quiet truths of so many others who had never been given the space to speak. The courtroom wasn't in a courthouse, it was a converted municipal meeting room in the Civic Building downtown, repurposed with microphones, state-appointed facilitators, and rows of chairs divided neatly into observers, press, representatives from law enforcement, and community leadership. It smelled faintly of floor wax and old paper, with the sterile hush of a place not used to real confrontation, but now forced to host it anyway. Evelyn arrived with Clarence at her side, his presence solid as always, his shoulders square, face unreadable, except for the faint crease between his eyebrows that only appeared when he was holding back anger. They were met at the door by Elijah Washington, their civil rights attorney, impeccably dressed, and carrying a tablet full of documents, statements, and video footage compiled with surgical precision. "They're going to posture," Elijah said quietly, "maybe even try to shift blame or stall. But we've got the record, the witnesses, and the law. Just speak your truth and let the rest fall where it may." Evelyn nodded, her breath slow, and measured the way it had been before every difficult surgery she ever performed. Inside the room filled gradually the murmur of voices rising and falling like a tide of unease. News cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking quietly like watchful eyes. Clarence scanned the crowd, noting familiar faces, community members who had come forward, colleagues from the hospital, even a few officers in uniform seated stiffly with arms folded and expressions unreadable. But what struck him most wasn't who was there, it was who wasn't. Several city council members had declined to attend, citing schedule conflicts, and the mayor had sent a written statement instead of appearing in person. The absences spoke louder than the speeches that would come. When Evelyn took the stand, she didn't bring notes or rely on prepared testimony. She simply adjusted the microphone, glanced briefly at Elijah, and then turned to face the panel with the quiet composure of someone who had nothing left to prove. "I wasn't planning to be here," she began, her voice calm but resonant. "I was supposed to be planting tomatoes that morning, maybe stopping by the bookstore, not standing handcuffed in a parking lot while strangers recorded my humiliation." Her eyes didn't waver, and for a moment the room held its breath. She described the moment she was accused, the absurdity of it, the way the accusation leapt from suspicion to certainty without a single question asked. She recalled the officer's hand on her arm, the tightening of the cuffs, the sting, not just in her wrists but in her spirit, and how no one, not even one bystander, had spoken up in her defense until it was too late. "I've saved lives," she said, evenly held the hands of dying patients, mentored young physicians, volunteered at free clinics, and none of it mattered that day. None of it protected me from their assumption that I didn't belong. The footage was played next, a compilation of cell phone videos, security footage from the store, and police body cam recordings. It was clinical in its cruelty. There was no raised voice from Evelyn, no aggressive movement, no resistance, only a quiet, poised woman being treated as though she were a threat. The panel watched without comment, but the shift in their body language was subtle and unmistakable, leaning forward, crossing arms tighter, avoiding one another's eyes. When Evelyn's voice on the recording asked, "May I please call my husband?" Afterward, Clarence took the stand. His testimony wasn't fiery but precise, detailed and layered with the weight of his years on the bench. He explained the protocol violations, the legal standard for probable cause, the repeated failures to follow even the department's own procedures. But more than that, he spoke of fear, not panic, but the quieter kind, the kind that sits beneath your skin when you realize that reason, facts, and credentials mean nothing to someone who's already decided you don't belong. "We were not asking for special treatment," he said. "We were demanding equal protection. There's a difference." Jade Mendoza testified next, sharing her data on racial disparities in policing within the region, including heat maps showing disproportionate stops in majority-white neighborhoods, and a disturbing trend of vague incident reports involving Black and brown residents. Her tone was analytical, but the implications were personal, especially when she revealed internal department emails that referred to keeping the neighborhood profile clean. There were gasps from the crowd, murmurs of disbelief, but not from Clarence or Evelyn, who had long known the ugliness of what was being exposed. Then came the community witnesses, a teacher who had been pulled over 3 times in a single semester for failure to signal, a nurse who described being followed around the grocery store with her toddler in tow, an older gentleman who admitted through tears that he had watched Evelyn's arrest from the parking lot and done nothing. "I thought if I got involved I'd end up cuffed too," he said softly. "But watching her now, I wish I had." When the testimonies ended, the room was quiet again, the kind of silence that signals not peace but reckoning. The panel thanked everyone, made vague promises to review the findings, and called for a recess. But it was clear to anyone truly paying attention that the narrative had shifted. The evidence wasn't just compelling, it was irrefutable. Outside, the afternoon sun had broken through the clouds, casting long beams of light across the steps of the Civic Center, where Evelyn now stood quietly surrounded by reporters, supporters, and a few who still weren't sure what side they were on. Clarence stepped beside her and gently placed a hand on her back, offering nothing more than presence. She glanced up at him and smiled, tired but full of the quiet strength that comes from finally being heard. They didn't speak much on the ride home. The road curved through familiar streets, past well-kept lawns and blooming dogwoods, places that looked the same but now felt entirely different. As they pulled into their driveway, Evelyn reached for Clarence's hand, not with urgency but with a kind of grounded relief. "Whatever comes next," she said softly, "we've already won something they can't take back." He didn't need to ask what she meant. The victory wasn't in the verdict, it was in the voices, the faces, the truths pulled from the shadows and laid bare in the light. And as they sat quietly in the stillness of their parked car, hands clasped between them, the weight that had once seemed immovable began ever so slightly to lift. 6 months after the hearing, Ashwood Creek no longer felt like the same town that had stood so still during Evelyn's arrest, though its sidewalks, brick storefronts, and shaded cul-de-sacs looked unchanged to the passing eye. Something in the air had shifted, something deep and invisible, like a long-stuck window finally opening after years of sealed silence. The officers involved had been formally dismissed after the internal investigation confirmed procedural misconduct, a carefully worded phrase that softened what everyone already knew to be a failure of both character and system. The police chief retired early, citing family reasons, but most understood that the pressure of public accountability had worn down even his practice detachment. George Simmons, the president of the local police union and father of the senior officer who had handcuffed Evelyn, faced federal charges not just for obstructing justice, but for actively orchestrating retaliation against witnesses. His name, now permanently etched into court records as a symbol of what happens when power is used to silence truth. Evelyn read the news quietly at the kitchen table the morning the charges were announced, sipping her tea while the radio hummed softly behind her. She didn't smile or frown, just closed the article and whispered. It had to happen, like someone acknowledging a long overdue diagnosis. But beyond the headlines, the deeper change was slower, more personal, and far more meaningful. The Department of Justice's inquiry led to a consent decree that forced the Sheriff's Department into mandatory reform bias training, revised arrest protocols, and the creation of a civilian review board with real disciplinary authority. It was the kind of oversight that many said would never happen in a town like Ashwood Creek. And yet it had, not because of some grand political movement, but because one woman refused to disappear into someone else's version of who she was. At the hospital, Evelyn resumed her work with a quiet intensity, but she noticed a shift in the way colleagues spoke to her, now less filtered, more conscious, more careful in the best ways. Younger staff began confiding in her not just about medical challenges, but about their fears, their experiences with profiling, their quiet exhaustion from being doubted before being known. She listened always without judgment and offered advice when asked, but more often she simply made space for their stories because she understood how rarely space was given freely. She also started a mentorship circle for minority medical students, a monthly gathering where laughter and vulnerability shared the same table. It wasn't about teaching surgical skills or navigating exams. It was about surviving the unspoken toll of being exceptional and still seen as other. "Excellence is not our shield," she told them one evening, her voice gentle but firm. "It's our contribution. But our humanity, that's not something we should have to earn." At home, Clarence transitioned into a quiet but significant role as a community liaison, not through any official appointment, but because people came to him. Residents who once avoided his gaze now knocked on their door to ask about property disputes, school policy concerns, or how to file complaints without retaliation. He never turned them away, though he never asked for thanks either. His desk became a map of civic engagement, highlighted ordinances, contact lists for legal aid, printed guides for reporting misconduct. Sometimes late at night, Evelyn would find him still working, glasses low on his nose, reading through yet another document. "You're building something, you know," she'd say, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I just want to make sure the ground holds," he'd reply. And the ground did hold, even as pressure came from other directions. A small but vocal group continued to claim the incident had been exaggerated, that the town was being unfairly portrayed, that perhaps Evelyn should have just cooperated more calmly. Anonymous comments appeared beneath news stories. Vague threats occasionally made their way through town gossip, but they no longer held the same sting. Evelyn no longer flinched when strangers looked too long, and Clarence no longer paused before stepping into a meeting room filled with people who used to smile too tightly. They were no longer waiting for permission to belong. Surprisingly, Karen Whitmore, the woman who had falsely accused Evelyn, was sentenced not to jail time, but to a year of restorative justice service. She spent that time volunteering at the First Baptist Food Pantry under Deacon Lattimore's supervision, where she was expected not just to serve meals, but to listen to the stories of those she once might have crossed the street to avoid. Evelyn saw her there once, stocking shelves in silence, and neither of them spoke. But there was something in Karen's posture, not apology, not yet, but something quieter, maybe the beginnings of understanding that remorse must be lived before it can be spoken. The neighborhood, too, began to soften in unexpected ways. The quarterly HOA meetings, once stiff and coded, now featured open floor sections where residents were invited to speak without time limits. A new diversity committee formed under the leadership of longtime residents and younger transplants alike. Someone suggested a block barbecue to celebrate the reforms, and to everyone's surprise, it wasn't Clarence or Evelyn who declined, but several of their more vocal former critics who chose not to attend. And still the event went on. Long tables stretched under the oaks, dishes passed hand to hand, laughter rising without effort. That afternoon, Evelyn watched a little boy, brown-skinned, barefoot, and sticky with watermelon juice, run across a lawn that had once felt like someone else's dream. And she thought just briefly that maybe this was what change looked like, messy, uneven, but alive. At the hospital, something unexpected happened that Evelyn rarely spoke about, not because it was a secret, but because it didn't need to be shared widely. Officer Hansen, the younger of the two who had detained her, came rushing into the ER one night with his mother, an elderly woman in the middle of a stroke. Evelyn was the attending neurosurgeon. She didn't hesitate. Her team moved fast, assessments were made, and within minutes she was scrubbing in. The surgery lasted 4 hours, delicate and unforgiving but successful. When it was over and Officer Hansen stood in the hallway outside recovery, his hands clasped like someone waiting for a verdict, Evelyn walked up to him, face calm and voice steady. "She'll make it. We caught it early." He looked at her for a long moment before saying thank you. Then after a pause, he added, "I've thought a lot about that day. I was wrong. All of it. I wanted you to know." Evelyn nodded once. "Now you do," she said softly, and walked away. As summer turned to fall, and then to winter, the ripples of their resistance continued to widen, not in sweeping gestures or front-page stories, but in the quiet, steady rhythm of community rebuilding itself. Schools introduced equity curriculum. The hospital's board approved a new patient intake policy that removed officer statements from medical triage. And perhaps most meaningfully, Evelyn and Clarence remained in their home, not in defiance, but in affirmation that no one could make them smaller than they were willing to be. 1 year after the arrest, Evelyn returned to Greenleaf Market. The aisles had been rearranged, the manager was new, and a sign near the entrance now read, "We serve everyone with dignity." It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is. But as she stood near the same display where it had all begun, now stocked with fall mums and discounted fertilizer, an older white woman approached, hesitation in her steps. "Excuse me," she said gently. "You're Dr. Carter, aren't you? You saved my grandson last winter. I just wanted to say thank you." Evelyn smiled, not out of politeness, but because it was real. She extended her hand and replied, "You're welcome." And in that moment, with the faint hum of fluorescent lights above and the scent of cinnamon brooms in the air, Evelyn Carter stood not as a victim or a symbol, but as a whole human being, unshaken, unbroken, and undeniably home. There are moments in life we don't choose, moments that come unexpectedly, unfairly, and make us question the world we live in, but it's how we respond to adversity that ultimately defines who we are. The story of Evelyn and Clarence Carter is not just about a wrongful arrest. It's a powerful testament to resilience, to quiet strength, and to the belief that justice only exists when we stand up and demand it. They didn't seek revenge. They didn't shout. They chose the hardest thing of all, to hold on to their dignity. And by doing so, they not only protected their own honor, but opened the door to change for an entire community. For those entering the later chapters of life, the message here is clear: you are never too old to do what's right. Your calm, when combined with wisdom and lived experience, can become the most powerful voice in a room full of silence. Never underestimate the strength of someone who knows who they are and refuses to bow. If this story moved you, please click the like button to help others hear it too. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories about courage, justice, and the quiet strength that changes the world.